live. Okay. It's exciting. And here we are. We should be live. Hi, everyone. I'm Emil Guillermo. You're going to be hearing me say, hi, I'm Emil Guillermo a number of times because we're just checking out the technicals here to make sure that we are, in fact, live. Hey, look, there we are. We're live. We're on the page. Hi, everyone. Emil Guillermo. I am the museum director of the Filipino American National Historical Society Museum. If you're just checking in, we usually check in a little early. We're going solo now. We're going, no guests today, but we have a lot of interesting subject matter. And I hope you're checking in because, well, once again, the Filipino American National Historical Society Museum is closed, which is not a good thing. But because of COVID and because of the pandemic, we have been closed since March. I mean, that's a reality. That's been tough. I took over as museum director in February, really January, February. Uh, we had a new exhibit starting up with Tony DeZuniga, the Marvel DC comic artist, and we were all set to let the public see it, and we got shut down because of the pandemic. Not an easy thing. We've been shut down for, I guess it's now been about 6 months. 6 months. Imagine that. Where were you when this whole thing started 6 months ago? Where were you? What were you thinking? And say, well, the museum's closed, but we'll be open up again shortly. Maybe a week, maybe a month, right? 2 months. Remember that? I mean, remember that those days in March? I mean, the Ides of March hit, boom, March 15th. We're shut down. And I'm thinking to myself, oh, God, I can't wait for summer, because they said that the virus will, go away. And then March passed, April, May. They canceled Filipino American or Asian American History Month or Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Oh, May. Oh, what about graduations? What about then June, July, August, September? We're looking at Filipino American History Month in October, and we likely will be closed again or still. So this is our journey here. And I thought just recently, within the last 4 weeks, I thought people need to know the museum is still here. We're still paying the rent on our building or the space we have at 337 Weber Avenue in Stockton. But you can't go in because the county is still not at a place where we can open up museums. If we had an outdoor museum, maybe, but we don't. So we're not opened up, and that pains me. But I thought, look, we can do these pop-ups. We can do these pop-ups. We can invite people to talk about Filipino American history. They don't always have to be some scholars. They could be people talking about their lives, talking about their history, because it's all part of our Filipino American National Historical Society Museum model, where we're telling our stories. It's not like the typical museum model, which is kind of colonial when you think about it, where you have a board and you have, funders, and they decide what gets told, what stories get told, what gets put on display. And usually it's an all-white board and all-white cast. I mean, it's the typical story, right? But this is different. The Filipino American National Historical Society Museum is different because this is our story. We're Filipino Americans. We're telling our story. I heard an interesting one that I'll share with you in a couple of weeks about Filipino or Filipinas who were at war and how they were left out of the compromise that gave people lump sums if they fought side by side the United States in the war, World War II. That's coming up in one of our pop-ups. So we have a lot of things we're sharing, historical stuff that, you know, major, but also the stuff that people would ordinarily discount. People would ordinarily say, that's not history. Why do we have to talk about that? But we're going to talk about what Filipino Americans, how they lived their lives, how they navigated American society and culture through the years, from the very beginning, from the turn of the 19th century to now. It's important. These are important stories. So informally, maybe formally, I call this Week in Filipino American History. If you got your FANHS calendar, your Filipino American National Historical Society calendar, you know, this is a big day, a big week, actually. September 8th is when the grape strike began, when they actually walked off. And you can see our pop-up from last week. We talked to Alex Idolor, and on the FANHS Museum Facebook page, that's Facebook at FANHS, FANHS Museum. We do the recording, and you can still see that, along with all the other videos that we've done with Dan Gonzalez talking about Filipino American history and the evolution of Filipino American history. But certainly September 8th, the day the actual walk-off or walkout began. And it's significant because the guy who started the Great Grape Strike of 1965 was Lariat Leong. And you can hear what Alex has to say about that and hear about what it was like to be a young boy growing up amid the grape strike. That's on Alex's interview on the FANHS Museum page. So that's September 8th. Then September 11th. I know September 11th is a big deal. But September 11th is a big deal because, not because of the towers. That's a big deal, certainly. But it also is the reason why we're talking again today. It was the day that Carlos Bulosan died. He died on September 11th, 1956 in Seattle. That's when he died. But most of the things that he did were, well, he did it up and down the western part of the United States, from Alaska down to Coachella, and a lot in San Joaquin Valley. We're going to talk about that. And we're going to talk about a bit that I wrote about in my Filipino American news columns in Inquirer.net, in Asian Week. Talk about Carlos Bulosan, just as we remember his passing on September 11th. That was his death day. I just want to finish off a thought about what we were told in March, because another thing that happened this week is that we learned that the president of the United States, he confessed to the Watergate journalist Bob Woodward in a late night conversation. He called Woodward and he said, I downplayed it. I downplayed it all. I didn't want people to panic. I mean, this is significant because you think about where we are. You think about where we are now with this virus. And if we didn't downplay it, if we knew exactly where we were, wouldn't it have been better now if things were addressed back in March, back in April, back in January? The president said he knew as early as February, first week of February. Didn't come forward about the attempt to flatten the curve until mid-March. And then we had 15 days and then we were shut down. if he had started a week, 2 weeks early, a month early? If he didn't take the downplay approach, would we be still closed now in September? Would we have more than 191,000 dead, among them Filipinos, Filipino Americans? We're talking about 191,000 dead here in the United States, but this is a worldwide pandemic. Something to think about in history. Certainly, people will look at that statement that was revealed in Woodward's book, and the book's coming out this week on September 15th, but it was unveiled by news media this past week. People will wonder, what would life had been had the president acted forthrightly, had he warned us, had he let us know about the severity of this disease that we're fighting, of this virus. He said, yeah, flu, deadly, this thing 5 times greater than the flu. That's what he told Woodward. The historical record will show that. And I hope our historical record will show what Filipino Americans did during that time. Were we responsible? Did we listen to the president, or did we listen to public health? Did we do what we could to control the spread of the virus? All I know is that the museum is still closed. The museum has been closed since March. We do these virtual pop-ups. But as I've said in these recordings in the past, I'm interested. What are Filipino Americans doing? How are they dealing with the pandemic now? And I hope that if you see or hear this, that maybe you email me your pictures, maybe snap a picture, take out your cell phone, right? There's an invisible cell phone here with my virtual green screen, but snap a picture and say, this is what Filipinos are doing during the pandemic. Are they gathering? Are they masking up? Are they not masking up? Are they adhering to social distancing? Are the nurses, are you getting the news from your relatives who are nurses or health field practitioners and are warning you that, hey, this is for real? Or are we coming undone and giving in to our instincts to want to congregate, to want to be together? I think the historical record, say in 10, 20 years, as we look back, might be interesting. Might be the stuff to say, yeah, this is how Filipino Americans weathered the storm. This is how they understood what the pandemic meant. So I take a snapshot, email it to me at filipinomuseum@gmail.com, filipinomuseum@gmail.com, and we'll post them as an historical ongoing record, contemporaneous record of how Filipinos are dealing with this historic period. And then 10, 20 years from now, we can look back and say, yeah, we pulled together, or yeah, we helped each other out, or no, we didn't. I hope we did. Anyway, send snapshots or your thoughts to filipinomuseum@gmail.com. I'll get it. I'll put it on. We'll talk about it. Now, back to this week in Filipino American history. I talked about Carlos Bulosan. Carlos Bulosan died on September 11th in Seattle. He's buried up there. I know that Seattle it's kind of a mecca to go see his gravesite. Actually, his gravesite is hard to get to. The gravesite that's easy to get to in Seattle is, you see tons of people going to see Bruce Lee's gravesite. But, just walking around Stockton, there are places in Stockton where Carlos Bulosan roamed, and that's important. If you ever come to Stockton, that's the reason why, a small part, that the Filipino American National Historical Society Museum is in Stockton. So I mentioned Bulosan's death on the 11th. I also should mention that on the 10th, I need my glasses here to read the calendar. On the 10th, anti-Filipino riots in San Joaquin Valley, 1934. 1934, that's the same year that the Tidings-McDuffie Act essentially excluded Filipinos. And it's part of the big anti-Filipino sentiment that was building, came to a peak with in 1934 with the Tidings-McDuffie Act, but it had been starting early on. In fact, if we go to Little Manila's in the Heart, which is Don Mabalan's classic, soon to be classic book, if it's not already classic, soon to be classic book about the making of Filipino American history or American community in Stockton, California. Don talks about the first recorded incidents of anti-Filipino violence in the United States. It took place in Stockton on New Year's Eve, 1926. And you might have seen the headline. I think we have the newspaper headline at the FANHS Museum. 8 whites and Filipinos were stabbed and beaten when white men entered hotels and pool halls looking for Filipinos to attack. And this is taken from chapter 2 of Don's book. Instead of placing the blame on the white thugs, the local paper, which was known as the Stockton Daily Evening Record, it's the same record as the record that I worked for, the record that Don worked for briefly. I worked for them just a couple of years. But the Stockton Daily Evening Record reported that Filipinos ran amok. They spelled it A-M-U-C-K, which rhymes with this other word, but it really should be spelled A-M-O-K. But Filipinos ran amok attacking whites. That's a quote. Racist terror and violence peaked in the fall and winter of 1929 to 1930 as the economy hit rock bottom, with white mobs using dynamite, bombs, and guns to intimidate Filipinos across the state. The atmosphere was so hostile for the immigrants that Bulosan, Carlos Bulosan, would later write that 1930 was, quote, the year of the great hatred. The lives of Filipinos were cheaper than those of dogs. And then Don goes on to write about how this fervor, anti-Filipino fervor, built up from 1926 in Stockton to 1930. It spread throughout the Central Valley. 1929, Exeter, Tulare County, and then, of course, down in the Central Coast. 1930, you had the incident in Watsonville, where Fermin Tabera, January 22nd, sleeping inside a bunkhouse when a bullet pierced his chest. And that's where it begins, right? 1926 to 1930. September 10th, according to the FANHS calendar, anti-Filipino riots in the San Joaquin Valley. So this thing is building up over time. And then in 1934, perhaps the peak, the Tidings-McDuffie Act passes, creates a deal with the Philippine government where Filipinos would be repatriated and Filipinos would be excluded from coming to America. A little bit of Filipino American history, a way to get into, this week in Filipino American history. We're talking about how all things kind of intertwine. We have the riots, we had the grape strike in September 8th, and then Carlos Bulosan on September 11th, his death. And I just want to point out how, Don goes into, she quotes Bulosan because this was Bulosan's territory, right? This is where he roamed, and at the Hotel Mariposa, that was the site where he was trying to organize workers, and that created a kind of backlash from people about what are these Filipinos up to? And this gets to my what I wanted to talk about, what I was writing. You know, Carlos Bulosan, he's the Filipino American literary lion. But what really was his life like? Now, we can go more into what Dawn says in her book about how he came here and tried to organize some workers. But where I pick up the story professionally, it was back in 2002. I started writing and talking to the historian, and I mention him now because he recently passed away. I'm talking about the Asian American scholar Lane Hirabayashi from UCLA. Also taught at the University of Colorado in Boulder. Also taught at San Francisco State. But Lane, good guy. His wife, Marilyn Alcazola, also a scholar. They both began at San Francisco State. I first began talking to them in 2002. They used the Freedom of Information Act to seek out the truth about how the FBI targeted Bulosan. And that kind of got, my ears perking, because the FBI, what would they want to do to keep a file on someone like Carlos Bulosan? But when you think about it, you think about his activities. In retrospect, it makes absolute perfect sense. Consider Bulosan comes in the 20s. He's a community's literary lion. His semi-autobiographical work, America's in the Heart, 1946, really the seminal story of American Filipino immigrant labor experience during the Depression. Don quoted how 1930, right, Filipinos' lives lower, they were lesser than dogs. In that novel, America's in the Heart, Bulosan wrote, quote, "I came to know that in many ways it was a crime to be Filipino in America. I feel like a criminal running away from a crime I did not commit. And this crime is that I am a Filipino in America." That was fiction, but based on reality. And we now realize it's far more reality-based than we know. Because despite his mainstream success, including publication in the Saturday Evening Post from 1946 to 1956, Bulosan was hurt by these accusations that he was a member of the Communist Party. And that's when I started my conversation with now the late Lane Hirabayashi and Marilyn Alcazola, who's still living in who I invited to come on the program, but she's still in mourning, as one can understand. And she politely refused to come on, but maybe later we'll get Marilyn back, because she was as important in the scholarship as Lane. They were partners. So they got the Freedom of Information Act. They wrote in 2012 how they obtained these files that showed that the FBI was looking at Bulosan between 46 and 56, around the same time that he was writing in the Saturday Evening Post. And the FBI ultimately determined that Bulosan was not a member of the Communist Party, not a member, but the surveillance had wrecked Bulosan's life. I mean, he essentially was it a black list or a brown list, or maybe it was a Filipino list? He was unemployable. He couldn't make a living as a writer. He started heavily drinking. It contributed to his ill health, and he died right when the surveillance and the conclusion that he wasn't a member of the Communist Party, too late. Carlos Bulosan was dead by September 11th, 1956 in Seattle. So I talked to Lane and Marilyn again in 2014, which is about 6 years ago. And they said it wasn't just the U.S. who was interested in Bulosan, but here's Carlos Bulosan in the United States, and the long arm of the Philippine government also wanted to know the writer's links to the Huks, the Hukbalahap, the communist rebels who fought for land reform in the Philippines. And, that fact was first revealed in a book in 2005 by Professor Augusto Espiritu, The Five Faces of Exile, the Nation, and the Filipino American Intellectuals. I mean, that was from research in the Bulosan Archive at the University of Washington. But Hirabayashi and Alcazar found an actual newspaper article which commented on the link. It bared the headline, link between PI and U.S. commies bared. And this is the thing about, newspapers being and specifically Filipino newspapers being the first draft of Filipino American history, which is, how I always viewed my work in the Filipino American media. And you can look at it in Dawn's book. She quotes not exclusively, but she quotes widely Marquelo's, Three Stars, other Filipino American newspapers. But this is the front page headline from this news clipping that Hirabayashi and Alcazar found. American investigators said they had found letters from Bulosan to members of the Huks, and it cites how the Philippine Military Intelligence Service was working with the intelligence service of the U.S. Army. But according to the newspaper, the only letter signed by Bulosan was written to one of the Huk leaders and reads, quote, "I like to extend my congratulations to you through Amado, whose presence in America cemented the progressive spirit of peoples on this continent and in that island with the fond hope that I will be able to put all our efforts into a big book for the world." I mean, it's exactly what Bulosan did in his last novel, The Cry and the Dedication. But was he a member of the Communist Party or the Huks? Marilyn Alcazar said it only shows that Bulosan's research technique for the eventual book, it was not membership in any group that would require his surveillance. So, and remember, the FBI concluded that Bulosan was not a Communist Party member. But this is it's important work, and it says something about what the fear that was existent in the United States, the fear that Carlos Bulosan already felt, right? Saying, hey, the crime is being Filipino in America. Well, the crime was also being Filipino in America with these circumstantial links to the Communist Party that would have the FBI and this trans-Pacific kind of surveillance hounding you, dogging you, preventing your employment, preventing your livelihood in the United States. This is a part of Filipino American history. So when you think of Carlos Bulosan, read his quotes, read the famous quotes that I cited from Little Manila's in the Heart, from Bulosan's book, America's in the Heart, and remember that the tortured life of the artist included FBI surveillance. And all the rest of us should know that if you truly love your freedoms, you should care about this story, because it proves that what happened to Bulosan can happen to any of us, even to this day, more easily and more efficiently than ever. So a little something on Carlos Bulosan, in a way, kind of multitasking, trying to remember the work of dear colleague Lane Hirabayashi, his wife, Marilyn Alcazar. Like I said, I invited Marilyn to come on to talk about this, but still mourning Lane's recent passing. And my condolences to her and her family, and hope that we can have her on soon to talk about Carlos Bulosan. But what a week this week in Filipino American history. We beginning with September 8th, the grape strike, of September 10th, which is um, commemoration of yet another anti-Filipino riot in the San Joaquin Valley in 1934. And then September 11th, the passing of Carlos Bulosan in 1956. So this is just an example of some of the things we do here on This Week in Filipino American History, which we call affectionately TWIFA. It provides you something to think about. We're going to cut this a little short today, so you can, maybe rewind, ponder. Maybe I'll post a link of the article that I wrote that ran in the Inquirer.net and also in Asian Week, which I'm proud to say is one of the citations in Little Manila is in the Heart. And I hadn't seen the footnote when when Don's book came out. Otherwise, I would have bragged about it then. Hey, I'm a footnote. I'm a footnote in Don's book. But humble brag, merely a humble brag. But anyway, yeah. So that's today's edition. Let me tell you about what's coming up tomorrow. This is also Suicide Prevention Week. And that's another thing about, when you think if President Trump had acted with the full force of his knowledge, now that's a scary thought, the full force of his knowledge. But if he had acted like as if he really knew that this virus was 5 times deadlier than the flu, he called it deadly stuff. If he acted like he knew that, hey, this is here, he just didn't want to panic anybody. But maybe if he had acted not with panic, but with a forthrightness to try to defeat the virus then and there, back in February, how would things be different now? Instead of 191,000 deaths here in America, instead of some of our kababayan, our Filipino American Americans who are on the front lines and who have died because of COVID, the nurses. How would that be different? And then how would it be different just between, people like you and me who are now cooped up in our homes, away from family members? And I got to think, you got to go to the most extreme situation. What about the family members? What about the family members who died? What about the family members who died, even though they didn't die with COVID, they died under COVID. And that meant you couldn't see them, you couldn't touch them, you couldn't be with them. And at their last moments, you couldn't, I mean, depending upon the hospital, like some hospitals were a little better than others, but some were strict and you were isolated from them. They were isolated from you. And then the funerals, limited, some of them with masses where you were forced to sign liability documents saying that you're not going to hold anyone you're going to hold everyone harmless in case you contracted the disease. I attended 2 memorial services where why was I even bothering Zooming? I saw my relatives in their coffins, but I was not there. They were not there. Yeah. It's the funerals of COVID are among the most emotional for me. And one of our board members was telling me about his mother who died under COVID. And it was heartbreaking. What if the president had acted forthrightly? Could we have avoided many of those stories, many of those histories? I think we probably could have. I think. I certainly don't think we would have been at 191,000 deaths in America. that's just a conjecture based on acting under the guise of Benjamin Franklin's "A Stitch in Time Saves Nine," had reacted sooner. Who knows? But now we have to live with the history that we've created. So tomorrow, I'll be talking about mental health. I'll be talking about how people have been dealing with COVID during these times. I mean, when we've had to cope, what does that mean? What does that mean to cope? And how do Filipino Americans cope? I'm going to talk to a Filipino American mental health expert who happens to be a former president of the Filipino American National Historical Society Museum. And we'll talk about how Filipinos are coping. She also is an expert on Filipino teen suicides, especially, well, it seemed to be a thing with women or young girls, but we know that it's not limited to just young females, although there was a rise in female suicides back in San Diego a time ago. So Judy's done some work on that. I'll talk to her about Judy Pataxel. I'm going to ask her about how Filipinos are coping, what Filipinos can do. If you're interested in mental health, check out my FANHS virtual pop-up tomorrow at noon. Okay, that's it. Have yourselves a great rest of the day. Once again, we do these because the museum is closed. Once again, we don't like to be closed. We want to be open. We know that you're willing to drive from wherever you are into Stockton, but we can't. We can't open up because the state says don't. So we're not open. And we're just trying to do these things virtually so you can check in. Check in on the weekends when we're open, Saturday, Sunday. Check in around noontime. Check in and see this week in Filipino American history. Check in and see what's happening here and what should be considered your public square. We'll talk about things. We'll see what's on your mind. In fact, I should have checked to see if we have any comments, because if there were a comment, certainly you can put something in. Oh, look, there's a comment. It said, my dad had the Filipino American Hour in the 40s at KSTN. I used to go to the transmitter with him on Saturdays. Wow, that's an interesting comment. That's from Ambrosio Mateo. And actually it's from, Ambrosio Mateo. It's interesting because KSTN was the station in Stockton. And as I recall, they were at the corner. They had the DJ or the announcer on the window, looking out over Weber Avenue, I believe, in Stockton. This is way back in the 60s. But back in the 40s, it was still around. And they had a transmitter site, which was out in some fields. So they had a main center where they, in downtown Stockton, later on in the 60s, but they actually transmitted from, it looked like out in the back 40s somewhere. And it's good to know that someone in the 40s had a Filipino American hour in the 40s. This is what we did, right? This is the model for Filipino American media. And it reminds me of how even in San Francisco, when I did, after I did work at the NBC affiliate, I did a Filipino American radio show called Bay Area Filipino on the old, I think it's still around, the old KEST, which was the time brokered in language radio station. But I did my Filipino show in English. It was in English because I wanted Filipino Americans who didn't speak Tagalog to understand. So it's good to know that someone has commented about KSTN, another station that ran Filipino programming. Anyway, all right. So back again tomorrow talking about Filipino mental health. Thank you very much for checking this out. Tell your friends about my Carlos Bulosan story. And until next time, remember, the museum is where you are. You are Filipino American history. Your story is Filipino American history. My name is Emil Guillermo. I'm the museum director of the FANHS Museum, and I hope that we can be open so we can be together again soon. But if we can't, you can find us here on the Facebook page of the FANHS Museum. Till next time, have a great day. See you again tomorrow.